My name is Clara Monroe. I am 32 years old, and I live on the 9th floor of a glass and steel building in Portland's Pearl District. From here, the city unfolds beneath me like a map of my own making. Morning mist often clings to the West Hills, and on clear days, the distant, snow-capped peak of Mount Hood stands like a silent guardian. The life I've built here, in this quiet sanctuary of clean lines and soft, gray light, is the result of 7 years of relentless effort. It was forged in the fire of late-night study sessions for my architecture exams, fueled by cheap takeout eaten over blueprints, and paid for with a single-minded determination that left little room for anything else. This apartment, with its polished concrete floors and panoramic windows, is more than just a home, it is a testament to my own quiet resilience. And yet, with a few carelessly chosen words, the foundation of this carefully constructed piece was about to be shaken to its core. The Monroe family gatherings, much like the persistent Oregon drizzle, were a predictable and often somber affair. They took place on the second Sunday of each month at my parents' sprawling home in Lake Oswego, a place of manicured lawns and a quiet, imposing stillness that always felt a world away from my life downtown. The house, a classic craftsman my father, Arthur, had meticulously maintained for 40 years, smelled of lemon polish and my mother's potpourri. I always made a point to arrive precisely 12 minutes late, a small, private rebellion, a silent declaration that I was no longer the dutiful daughter who molded herself to fit every expectation. My father, a retired civil engineer, opened the door with a nod, his embrace brief and methodical, a gesture born of habit rather than warmth. Inside, my mother, Eleanor, was arranging a platter of smoked salmon and capers, her movements precise and elegant. Her entire world was this house and the family within it, and she curated it with the same intensity an artist brings to a canvas. My younger sister, Chloe, was curled on the velvet armchair, her phone held aloft, her thumb scrolling through a life happening somewhere else. At 26, Chloe was a whirlwind of artistic aspirations and romantic dramas. She was beautiful and effervescent, a free spirit who drifted through life, always managing to land in a crisis that the rest of us were expected to navigate. Her latest was the fallout from a whirlwind romance with a musician she'd followed to New York, only to return a month later with a broken heart and an empty bank account. "Clara, there's tea," my mother said, her eyes not leaving the placement of a dill sprig. "Dinner will be ready soon." I moved into the dining room, where the long oak table was set with heirloom china and linen napkins. It was beautiful, but it felt like a museum exhibit, a carefully preserved image of a perfect family. I knew, with a sinking feeling, that I was not just a guest at this dinner, I was a character in a play, and my lines had already been written for me. We were halfway through my mother's impeccably poached salmon when my father placed his fork and knife together on his plate, a silent, familiar signal that an announcement was imminent. It was a gesture that always preceded a verdict, and I instinctively braced myself. "Chloe is going to need a place to stay for a little while," he began, his tone as level and dispassionate as if he were discussing city zoning. "We've talked it over. It makes the most sense for her to move into your apartment temporarily." The bite of salmon I'd just taken felt like a stone in my throat. I set my water glass down with a soft click, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "My apartment?" I managed, my voice thin. "Yes," my mother added, her gaze fixed on my father. "You have that lovely second bedroom, and you're so often at the firm late anyway. Your studio is barely used in the evenings." A hot, prickling sensation crept up my neck. My studio? Did anyone think to ask me about this? My voice was quiet, but it trembled with a pressure that had been building for years. Chloe finally looked up from her plate, a small, almost apologetic smile on her face. "It would just be for a couple of months, Clara. Just until I get back on my feet. It's so crowded here, and your place in the Pearl is just perfect. It's the logical solution." Logical. The word hung in the air, clinical and detached. She spoke of my home as if it were a strategic asset, a resource to be deployed, not the sacred space I had poured my soul into creating. A dry, hollow laugh escaped my lips. My studio isn't a spare room for rent, Chloe. And I don't remember being part of this talking it over. My father let out a quiet sigh of exasperation. My mother, ever the planner, simply said, "We can help her move in next weekend. Your father can borrow your Uncle Robert's pickup. We still have that guest mattress in the garage. It will fit perfectly." It was like watching a scene unfold from behind a thick pane of glass. The script was finalized, the props were secured, the logistics were arranged. The only person who hadn't been consulted was the one whose life was being casually rearranged. I placed my napkin on the table. "I don't agree to this. Clara," my mother's voice was low and laced with disappointment, the tone she used when I was a child and had failed to live up to her standards. "We're a family. Family helps one another." "Really?" The words were out before I could stop them. "Then why can't Chloe sleep on the sofa bed in the den here? Or stay in Aunt Susan's guest cottage? Or why can't she get a job and find a roommate, the way I did when you told me it was time to be an adult?" The ensuing silence was heavy and suffocating. Chloe recoiled as if I'd slapped her, her artistic sensitivity wounded. "You don't have to be so harsh, Clara," she whispered. I looked from her crestfallen face to my parents' stern expressions. "This apartment is the one thing in my life that is entirely mine. I earned it. It's not a halfway house. It's not communal property." "You're being overly dramatic," my father said, his voice clipped. "It's a temporary situation. You're making a mountain out of a molehill." I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Temporary is still an invasion when it happens without consent. No one said a word. They didn't have to. The message was as clear as the crystal glasses on the table. In their eyes, I was still the reliable, sturdy foundation of the family, unseen, but always expected to bear the weight. I was the one who didn't cause problems, so I was the one who could absorb them. But as I walked out of that house, the familiar weight on my chest felt different tonight. It wasn't just resignation, it was a cold, hard stone of resolve. No one had told me to leave, but I had long ago learned that exile in my family was a quiet affair. It didn't require a dramatic exit, only the silent acceptance of a role you no longer wished to play. Driving back to the city, the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers did little to clear my thoughts. The past rose up around me, a fog of memories and unspoken rules. Growing up, my role in the Monroe family was implicitly understood. I was the responsible one, the quiet pillar. My older sister, Isabel, was the star. She was brilliant, charismatic, and sailed through law school at Stanford, her path paved with praise and financial support. Every achievement was celebrated with grand dinners and proud announcements to friends. When she bought her first condo in San Diego, my parents co-signed the loan and gifted her a $20,000 housewarming check. They flew down to help her decorate, their pride a tangible thing. Then there was Liam, my younger brother, 2 years Chloe's junior. He was the seeker, perpetually on a journey of self-discovery, funded by my parents. He'd switched majors 4 times before dropping out of the University of Oregon to find his truth in Southeast Asia. Every setback was framed as a learning experience, every poor decision a necessary part of his growth. When he ran up a significant credit card debt on a spiritual retreat, my father cleared it with a quiet wire transfer, explaining it was an investment in his son's well-being. And then there was me. I was the one who learned to be self-sufficient because I had to be. I taught myself how to sew on a button in middle school, navigated the labyrinthine world of student aid applications alone, and worked 2 jobs through college to cover what my partial scholarship didn't. I was proud of my independence, but there was a quiet ache in knowing it wasn't just a choice, but a necessity. I remembered getting a severe case of pneumonia in my final year of university, a week before my final thesis was due. I called my mother from the hospital, my voice raspy. Her response was distracted. "Oh, dear. Well, drink plenty of fluids." "I can't talk long," Isabel just made partner at her firm and were planning a celebration. The city lights of Portland shimmered through the rain-streaked windshield, a constellation of possibilities. My heart, however, felt like an old, creased map, its paths worn down by years of walking the same tired routes. I pulled into my designated spot in the secure garage, the silence a welcome embrace. Upstairs, I unlocked my door with a touch of my finger, a security feature I'd upgraded after my mother had once let herself in with a spare key to tidy up while I was away on a business trip, rearranging my books and throwing out what she deemed clutter. The apartment was still a haven of order and peace. I ran my hand along the cool marble of my kitchen island, my gaze falling on a framed photograph hanging by the doorway. It was a picture I'd taken on a solo backpacking trip along the Oregon coast, a wind-swept cypress tree clinging tenaciously to a cliffside, its branches shaped by the relentless wind. It was a symbol of resilience, of beauty forged in solitude. No one in my family had ever asked about that trip, just as they'd never asked why I'd chosen architecture, a field that required such precision and patience, or why my greatest joy came from creating spaces where people could feel safe and whole. I opened my laptop, the soft glow illuminating my face. In a blank document, I typed a single sentence: "My peace is not a resource for others to consume." For years, my life had been about accommodation. I had shrunk myself to make room for Isabel's brilliance, Chloe's crises, and Liam's wanderings. Favoritism in my family wasn't a shout, it was a slow, persistent drip, like the Oregon rain that seeps into the foundations of a house until, one day, you notice the rot. I walked into my studio. My mother had called it the extra room, a phrase that diminished its importance. But to me, this space was sacred. It held my drafting table, my sketches for a community green space project I was volunteering for, and shelves of books on sustainable design. It was the physical manifestation of my dreams. The thought of Chloe here, amidst my work, her chaotic energy filling the corners of my sanctuary, felt like a physical violation. It wasn't about a lack of love for my sister, it was about the desperate, primal need to protect the one part of my life that was unequivocally mine. With a deep breath, I opened my email. I composed a message to Mr. Henderson, the building manager. The subject line was simple: guest policy clarification. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. If my family couldn't see the lines I had drawn around my life, then I would have to start reinforcing them with steel. For most of my life, I believed that patience was a virtue, that if I was just accommodating enough, gentle enough, my family would eventually see me, truly see me. But I had learned a hard lesson over the years. In the Monroe household, my silence wasn't seen as peacefulness. It was interpreted as permission. I was 15, during a sweltering Oregon summer, when my mother announced that I would be spending my vacation watching my aunt's 2 young sons. They were sweet boys, but they were tornadoes of energy. For 6 weeks, while my friends were at summer camps or working their first jobs at local cafes, I was a de facto nanny. I woke at dawn to make pancakes, refereed squabbles over toys, and spent my afternoons in a state of high alert. I wasn't asked, I was informed. When I tried to gently protest, wanting just 1 week to myself, my mother's face clouded with disappointment. "Clara, your aunt is overwhelmed. It's the loving thing to do. Don't you have a compassionate heart?" That question, "Don't you have a compassionate heart?" became a weapon used against me for years. It was a subtle accusation that to say no was to be selfish, to be unkind. In college at the University of Washington, I earned a scholarship that covered nearly 80% of my tuition. I was ecstatic, feeling the pride of an accomplishment that was entirely my own. The week before I moved into my tiny off-campus apartment in Seattle, however, my mother called. A distant cousin, a girl I'd met twice, was doing an internship in the city and needed a place to stay. My apartment had 1 small bedroom and a pull-out sofa I'd bought from a thrift store. Still, I was told it was my family duty to share. For 3 months, I slept on an air mattress on the floor of my own living room while my cousin occupied my bedroom. She used my things without asking, complained about the city's gloom, and often had friends over late at night, their laughter echoing in the small space while I tried to study. I tried to speak to my mother about it once. Her response was swift and cold. "You are fortunate to have what you have, Clara. Don't be ungrateful. It's only for a few months. Show a little generosity." So I learned. I learned to be a guest in my own life. I learned to wait, to step back, to make myself smaller so that others could have more space. It became an unconscious habit, like holding your breath when you walk into a tense room. You forget you're even doing it, until the moment you finally, desperately need to breathe. This apartment in Portland was my first full breath. Every piece of furniture was chosen by me, every book on the shelf was one I loved, every corner was a reflection of the person I was, not the person I was expected to be. So when my mother dismissed my studio as barely used, my entire body tensed. It wasn't that she didn't understand, it was that she didn't feel the need to. To her, my space, my time, my energy, they were all flexible resources, available for reallocation as the family saw fit. I thought of Liam, who had once accidentally backed his car into a neighbor's prized rose garden. My father had paid for the landscaping repairs and smoothed things over with a bottle of expensive wine. I thought of Isabel, who had once quit a prestigious internship because it wasn't creatively fulfilling, and my parents had praised her for knowing her own worth. But when I had declined to host a family friend's son for a weekend because I was on a tight deadline for a major project at my firm, Monroe and Sterling Architecture, my mother had called me preoccupied and a little cold. Every boundary I set was interpreted as a barrier, every no a personal rejection. My best friend, Maya, a therapist living in Seattle, listened patiently on the phone as I recounted the dinner. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before saying, her voice gentle but firm, "Clara, your family doesn't see boundaries as lines. They see them as suggestions. And your no has been so quiet for so long, they've stopped listening for it." I used to think family was an unbreakable bond. Now I was beginning to understand that the only bonds that last are the ones rooted in mutual respect. A home without boundaries isn't a sanctuary, it's a public thoroughfare. And a person without agency isn't living, they're performing a role in someone else's story. I looked around my quiet, peaceful apartment and knew, with absolute certainty, that I was ready to start writing my own. I picked up my phone and booked an appointment with a name Maya had given me months ago. It was time to find my own voice, even if it started as a whisper. Dr. Anya Sharma's office was in a restored brick building in the Alphabet District, a space that felt both professional and deeply calming. Sunlight streamed through tall, arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room was filled with books and thriving plants, and it smelled faintly of sandalwood. It was a space designed for careful thought. "Clara," Dr. Sharma said, her voice warm as she welcomed me in. I sat in a comfortable armchair, my hands twisting in my lap. It took me a moment to begin, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was so unaccustomed to having a space held for me to say it. I told her about the dinner, about the expectation that I would absorb Chloe's crisis. I spoke of my family's dynamics, not with bitterness, but with the quiet resignation of someone stating facts. When I finished, Dr. Sharma leaned forward slightly, her gaze compassionate but direct. "You've used the word accommodate several times," she observed. "Do you often feel that you have to earn your place in your family by being useful?" The question landed with the force of a physical blow. I had no answer, because the answer was my entire life. It was in every holiday I'd organized, every crisis I'd smoothed over, every time I'd set my own needs aside for the sake of family harmony. Leaving her office that day, I didn't feel miraculously healed, but something had shifted. It was like the moment the barometric pressure drops before a storm, a change in the very air. On the drive home, I didn't rush. I stopped at my favorite coffee shop, The Daily Grind, and sat by the window, watching the rain fall, not as an inconvenience, but just as a fact of the world. The next evening, my mother called. I saw her name flash on the screen and my heart did a familiar, anxious flutter. But instead of answering, I let it go to voicemail. It was a tiny act of defiance, but it sent a jolt through me. I put my phone face down, brewed a cup of mint tea, and put on a record of soft, instrumental music. I was choosing my own soundtrack. A few days later, an email from my father arrived. The subject was Christmas plans. The message was brief: "Your mother is thinking of hosting this year, but it's a lot for her. She was hoping you could take charge of the logistics, coordinating arrivals and the main meal, like you did last time. Let us know." I remembered last Christmas. I had spent the week before creating spreadsheets, booking flights for Liam, and planning a multi-course menu to accommodate everyone's dietary preferences, all while juggling a major project deadline. I had been exhausted, running on fumes and caffeine, while everyone else enjoyed the holiday. I typed my reply, my fingers moving slowly but deliberately. "Hi Dad, thank you for letting me know. I won't be able to manage the planning this year as I need to conserve my energy for work and personal projects. I'm happy to bring a side dish, of course. I hope the planning goes smoothly. No excuses. No elaborate justifications. Just a simple, clear boundary." The moment I clicked send, my pulse quickened. But it wasn't the familiar, spiraling anxiety. It was a clean, sharp adrenaline, the kind you feel after a strenuous hike. It was the feeling of having climbed a steep hill and finally being able to see the view. The response came not from my father, but from my older sister, Isabel, a day later. A text message: "Mom is really hurt. I don't understand what's gotten into you lately. It's just organizing a dinner." I read the message, took a deep breath, and set my phone aside. I didn't reply. Maya came over that weekend, and as we sat on the floor of my living room with mugs of hot cocoa, I told her everything. She listened, her expression thoughtful. "You're not becoming a different person, Clara," she said softly. "You're just finally allowing yourself to take up the space you deserve. You've been living in a house built for you, but you've only been using one small room." I looked around my apartment, at the soft glow of the lamps on the walls, the art I had chosen, the books I had collected. The space itself hadn't changed, but it felt larger, as if it were expanding to make room for the person I was becoming. The next time I saw Dr. Sharma, she asked me what had felt different about my week. I said no, I told her, a small smile touching my lips. Twice. And the world didn't end. She smiled back, a genuine, radiant smile. "No," she said. "It just began to rearrange itself around you." That evening, I sat at my drafting table for hours, rereading my building's lease agreement. I found the clause I was looking for under Section 8, guest and occupancy. Any guest staying for a period exceeding 10 consecutive days, or 20 days in a 6-month period, is considered a temporary occupant and requires prior written consent from building management, including a formal guest application. Below, in bold, it stated that violations could be grounds for lease termination. The language was cold and legal, but to me, it was a shield. It was the tool I needed not to start a war, but to peacefully defend my own territory. I drafted a polite, professional email to Mr. Henderson, explaining that I was planning a 2-week work-related trip to a sister firm in San Francisco and was considering having a trusted colleague house sit to look after my plants and collect my mail. I was careful to frame it as a proactive inquiry to ensure I was in full compliance with building policy. His reply was prompt and businesslike. He attached the official guest declaration form, which required a copy of the guest's ID and a signed agreement. It was all procedural, transparent, and beautifully devoid of emotional complications. Now I just needed a guest. My first thought was of a few friends, but their lives were complicated with pets and partners. Then I remembered Leo, a talented graphic designer at my firm. I'd overheard him telling someone that his apartment building was undergoing a major plumbing refit, and he'd have to move out for a few weeks. He was quiet, respectful, and known for being meticulously organized. I found him in the break room the next day. "Leo," I began, "I know this is out of the blue, but I heard about your apartment situation. I'm going to be out of town for 2 weeks, and I need someone to stay at my place. It would be a formal, temporary arrangement, all above board with my building." His eyes widened in surprise, then relief. "Clara, that would be amazing." "Are you sure?" "Positive," I said. "Let's grab coffee after work. I'll have the paperwork ready." That evening, Leo met me, carrying a folder with a copy of his driver's license. I had drafted a simple agreement outlining the dates and his responsibilities, essentially, to keep the place tidy and not have guests over. I explained, in vague terms, that I was dealing with a complicated family situation and that my primary need was for the space to be officially and legally occupied to prevent any misunderstandings. He nodded, his expression conveying complete understanding. "You don't need to explain," he said. "Just tell me the rules. The main rule is this: no one enters without your permission. If anyone from my family shows up, you can politely tell them you are the registered temporary occupant and I am unavailable." "Consider it done," he said, signing the document with a firm, steady hand. I scanned the signed forms and his ID, emailed them to Mr. Henderson, and received a confirmation of approval within the hour. It was done. Every loophole was closed. As a final measure, I installed a small, discreet security camera facing my front door, its feed accessible on my phone. I trusted Leo completely, but I didn't trust the narrative my family might try to create in my absence. 3 days later, a text from my mother: "Your father and I are renting a U-Haul for this Saturday. Chloe is so excited, she's already bought new bedding. Please make sure the studio is cleared out." It wasn't a question. It was a directive. I didn't reply to her. Instead, I sent a short message to Leo: "Just a heads up, my family might arrive on Saturday. Remember our agreement." He replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji and the words: "I have a fresh pot of coffee and the focus of a designer on a deadline. I'm ready." On Friday afternoon, I packed a small suitcase, along with my laptop and a few treasured personal items. I drove north, up the coast, to a small, secluded inn I knew at Cannon Beach. I checked in, the scent of salt and pine filling my lungs. As I walked along the misty shoreline, watching the waves crash against Haystack Rock, the turmoil in my mind began to quiet. I was no longer just reacting, I was acting. I was the architect of my own life, and I was finally reinforcing the walls. Saturday morning broke, gray and misty. I woke with a sense of calm anticipation. Around 10:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the security camera. I opened the app, my heart beating a steady rhythm against my ribs. The live feed showed my father, looking resolute, knocking on my door. My mother stood beside him, clutching a box of what looked like kitchen supplies. Behind them, Chloe stood, looking both excited and nervous, a large duffel bag at her feet. The door opened. Leo stood in the doorway, wearing a simple gray sweater, a mug in his hand. He didn't step aside to let them in. I couldn't hear the audio, but I could see the conversation unfold. My father's expression shifted from authoritative to confused. My mother began to gesture emphatically toward the hallway. Chloe's hopeful smile faltered, and she pulled out her phone, likely to call me. Then I saw Leo hold up a piece of paper, the signed guest agreement, and point to a line. My father took a step back, his shoulders slumping slightly. A moment later, a building security guard, alerted perhaps by the extended conversation in the hall, appeared. After a brief, quiet exchange, my family turned and walked away. Their faces were a mixture of anger, hurt, and utter disbelief. My mother's hand was clenched so tightly around her purse strap that her knuckles were white. I took a long, deep breath, the salty air filling my lungs. I saved the video clip to a secure folder and closed the app. The storm had made landfall, and my home was still standing. The digital onslaught began the next morning. My phone was a constant buzz of notifications. 7 missed calls from my mother. 4 from my father. A long, rambling series of texts from Chloe, oscillating between wounded indignation and outright anger. My mother's first message read, "I cannot believe you would do this to us, Clara. To your own sister. This is the ultimate betrayal." It was followed by a photo of Chloe sitting dejectedly on her duffel bag in the lobby of their house, with the caption, "This is what you've reduced her to." My father's text was more concise but carried the weight of his profound disappointment. "You have brought shame upon this family. Call me at once." I set my phone on the wooden nightstand and walked out to the small balcony of my room. The cool, damp air was a balm. It was real, tangible, unlike the manufactured guilt being beamed at me through my device. An hour later, I glanced at the security feed. Leo was sitting on my sofa, reading a book, a picture of tranquility. In the hallway outside, my parents had returned, this time with Mr. Henderson, the building manager. I watched the silent pantomime. My mother's tense posture, her hands gesturing wildly. Mr. Henderson's calm demeanor. He looked at a clipboard, then spoke to them. My mother pulled out her phone, her lips moving in a tight, angry line. Finally, she turned and marched down the hall, defeated. My phone rang. "Chloe." I watched the screen, letting it ring until it went silent. A new message appeared a moment later. "I have nowhere to go. Mom is crying. Dad won't even look at me. I just needed a little help, Clara." Is that too much to ask? It wasn't a question. It was a final, desperate attempt to pull me back into the old dynamic. Later, a novel-length message from my mother arrived, starting with a detailed recollection of a time she nursed me through the chicken pox at age 6, and ending with, "And this is how you repay that love? By putting a stranger in your home and casting your own family out into the street?" I didn't engage. Instead, I texted Maya. "It's escalating." She called immediately, her voice a steady anchor. "Let me guess," she said. "Guilt, historical revisionism, and a demand for you to fix the pain they believe you've caused?" "Word for word," I said, a small, tired laugh escaping me. "Are you feeling guilty?" she asked gently. "A part of me is," I admitted, my voice quiet. "Even knowing I did the right thing, it feels harsh." "You weren't harsh, Clara," she corrected me. "You were clear. They were never entitled to your space in the first place. You didn't kick anyone out, you simply held your ground." Her words settled over me, a profound and simple truth. My eyes drifted toward the ocean, to the waves that rose and fell with a power that answered to nothing but the moon. That afternoon, Chloe posted a photo to her Instagram story, a dramatic, black-and-white selfie, her eyes looking artfully sad. The caption, "Sometimes the people you think are your safe harbor are actually the storm." A dozen of her friends left sympathetic comments. I took a screenshot, not out of anger, but as a piece of data. "She doesn't want a resolution," I texted to Maya. "She wants an audience." That night, I silenced my phone. The constant stream of accusations and emotional pleas had been an attempt to erode my resolve, a high tide of guilt meant to wash away my boundaries. But as I lay in the quiet hotel room, listening to the distant roar of the ocean, I felt a stillness I hadn't known was possible. I had built a seawall, and for the first time, I felt safe in my own harbor. I chose a quiet cafe in the Selwood neighborhood for the meeting, a neutral territory of exposed brick and the rich aroma of roasting coffee. I arrived early, claimed a corner table, and ordered a latte. Placing my phone face down on the table was a conscious act, a promise to myself to be present and grounded. My parents arrived together, their expressions somber, as if they were attending a deposition. My father's posture was rigid in his tweed blazer, my mother's hands were clasped tightly around her leather handbag. Chloe arrived a few minutes after them, looking smaller and more uncertain than I'd ever seen her. Her usually vibrant artist's attire was replaced by a simple gray sweater, her hair pulled back from a face scrubbed clean of makeup. No one spoke as they sat. The silence was thick with unspoken resentments. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my latte before I began. "I didn't ask you here to fight," I said, my voice even. I asked you here because there are things that need to be said, things that I should have said a long time ago. My father's jaw tightened. My mother fussed with her napkin. When you decided that Chloe would move into my studio without asking me, I continued, looking at each of them in turn, it was more than just an inconvenience. It was a message that my life, my space, and my choices are not my own. That they are subject to a family vote where I don't get a say. You live by yourself in a 2-bedroom apartment, my mother countered, her voice strained. Your sister was in trouble. It seemed like the most compassionate solution. Compassionate for whom? I asked gently. I wasn't consulted. I was informed. As always. You're turning a simple family matter into a legal dispute, my father interjected, his voice low and firm. Dad, family shouldn't be an excuse to disregard a person. For my entire life, I have been the one to accommodate, to absorb the impact, to say yes. And no one ever stopped to ask if I was okay. Chloe stirred, her eyes fixed on the wooden table. I thought you would be okay with it, she mumbled. Mom said you'd understand. I turned my gaze to her. Did you ever think of calling me yourself, Chloe? To ask me directly? The silence that followed was her answer. We are a family, my mother said, her hands fluttering. We should be finding solutions, not placing blame. Mom, I have been the solution my whole life, I said, the words finally coming, not with anger, but with a profound sadness. I have been the solution that allowed Isabel to focus on her career, that allowed Liam to find himself, and that allowed Chloe to chase her dreams without a safety net, because everyone knew I would be there to weave one. I was never seen as a person with my own needs. I was seen as a resource. My father's shoulders slumped. The deep furrow between his brows seemed to soften. Perhaps, he said, his voice quieter now, we grew too accustomed to your strength. It wasn't intentional. I know, I said, and I truly did. But intention doesn't change the impact. And I can no longer carry a burden that I was never meant to bear alone. Chloe finally looked up, her eyes glistening. I'm sorry, Clara, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I shouldn't have just assumed. I always figured you had it all together. It never occurred to me that you might be struggling, too. I've been so used to being the one who needs help, I forgot to see that you might need support, too. The raw honesty in her voice surprised me. My mother let out a long, shaky breath. I didn't know how else to handle it, she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. I just wanted my 2 girls to be together. I was afraid you would say no if I did. So you chose to command instead of request, I stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring, a nervous habit I knew well. It was my father who broke the final, tense silence. It seems we have some things to relearn about how this family operates, he said, looking from my mother to Chloe, and then to me. Your mother and I have enabled a system that isn't fair to you. That changes today. A knot I hadn't even realized I was holding in my chest began to loosen. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was air. It was space to breathe. I'm not pushing you away, I said softly. I'm just asking you to knock. My parents said nothing, but for the first time, their silence didn't feel like a judgment. It felt like they were listening. Chloe reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a list of apartment shares she'd printed from Craigslist. She slid it across the table. I'm going to start making some calls this afternoon, she said. Maybe you could help me look over a lease if I find a place? I can give you advice, I said, meeting her gaze. But you have to be the one to sign it. This has to be yours. She gave a small, watery smile. I'm trying, she said. When we left the cafe, there were no hugs, but as I walked to my car, the space between us felt different. It was no longer fraught with unspoken expectations. It was just space, clean and clear, defined not by distance, but by a newfound respect. 3 weeks later, I received a text from Chloe. It was a photo of a sunny, slightly cluttered room in a shared house in the Hawthorne district. She was in the center of the frame, holding up a set of keys, a genuine, unself-conscious smile on her face. Signed the lease today, the text read. On my own. Mom and Dad helped with the security deposit, but it's my name on the dotted line. Thank you for showing me what standing on your own 2 feet looks like. I smiled, a real smile that reached my eyes, and typed back, I'm proud of you. We met for lunch the following weekend at a food cart pod, her choice. She was vibrant, talking about the part-time job she'd gotten at a local art supply store and the new therapy she'd started. I told Dr. Hartman all about you, she said, biting into a taco. I told her my sister is an architect, not just of buildings, but of boundaries. The changes in my parents were more subtle, like the slow turning of seasons. My mother started calling just to chat, asking about my projects, my friends. Before holidays, she would ask, what are your thoughts on getting together, not here is the plan. My father's calls remained brief, but his questions changed. How is work, became are you feeling fulfilled by your work? One afternoon, he called to say he was in town and asked if I had time for coffee. We sat in a quiet corner, and he looked at me over the rim of his cup. I always thought your independence was a kind of rebellion, he said. I'm beginning to see it was a form of survival. One we should have taught all our children. He paused. Did we make you feel you had to build your own fortress to be safe from us? I didn't have to answer. He already knew. I returned to my life, but the rhythm of it felt different, steadier. The quiet of my apartment was no longer just a reprieve from the world, but a space I had actively protected and reclaimed. The boundaries I had built had not, in the end, pushed my family away. They had simply invited them to find a new, healthier way to be close. They had drawn a clear and loving line around my home, and in doing so, had given everyone the space to find their own. One evening, I stood by my window, looking out at the glittering lights of the city. My hand rested on the cool glass, and I felt a profound sense of peace. It was the peace that comes not from the absence of storms, but from knowing you have built a shelter strong enough to withstand them. Victoria's story may have been a stark reminder, but my own had taught me that boundaries are not walls that shut others out, they are the foundations upon which true, respectful, and lasting love can be built. And sometimes, that foundation begins with the quiet, revolutionary power of a single, well-placed no.